So as I was watching that clip where Shunyamurti spoke, he was referring to the term of Pratibha, and the way he spoke about it was unfamiliar to me. He was making reference to, this aspect of where the phenomenology is actually reflecting consciousness. And so I couldn't really make sense of it. So I looked it up, and then I found Pratibha to be, at least from a tantric point of view, spiritual illumination, let's say, which is then by definition taking away avidya. So I couldn't really make sense of how he used it, and therefore I was keen to hear your comment, to hear your commentary on what he was trying to say.
Well, first of all, this is what happens with us non-Sanskritists and, with us who do not really learn Sanskrit. And so I presume he simply used that term mistakenly. He completely used a wrong term. So let us look into this so as to what pratibha actually means and what perhaps Shunyamurti was trying to illustrate his delivery in that particular clip when he used that term with regard to the reflection, the reflective awareness. So as you rightly have pointed out when you looked it up, pratibha is a light of consciousness. In fact, pratibha in Sanskrit is a very important term. And it's also a name. It means it could be female or likewise female and male name. Pratibha, it's that intuitive insight, often spoken of in terms of that flash of an insight, where we all of a sudden become aware of the essential reality of who we are. Therefore, in the respective schools, now in this case both, in Advaita Vedanta, in the Brahma Sutras, and in the Tantras, in Shaiva Tantra, Kashmir Shaivism, respectively, this term is given a tremendous importance, because pratibha is that what it's illumining quality of consciousness, but also is that what gives rise, when pratibha develops, and it can be developed, to intuitive knowledge. Whereas we know things often in sequential manner, simply because this is the way the mind functions. In order to know something, an object of our perception, an object of our study, there is this sequential unfoldment, right, from one thought to another thought to another thought, so that from one object to another object to another object. Pratibha is none of that. Pratibha is not a linear unfoldment within the faculties. It's a sudden illumination which is giving us that sense of all of it at once. So, therefore, it is also spoken of in terms of as perhaps the most important asset in the unfoldment in that spiritual unfoldment that we speak of. Because we cannot possibly have knowledge of various aspects We can only have knowledge of a certain area. You can be knowledgeable in this area, in that area. You can be quite a polymath in the way you can know about things. But it's impossible to know it all. And yet it is possible to have an intuitive insight. And the way tradition views Pratibha is that the quality of that intuitive insight supersedes any other form of knowledge. And therefore, often Pratibha is equated with Parashakti. Pratibha is nothing other than the supreme quality of I consciousness. This is the very, very essence of Pratibha. So in other words, whenever we speak about that, what we spoke quite a lot lately, this last year, let's say, increasingly as the part of the Kundalini course and also our live immersion at the Good Samster last August, with that overall theme of the retreat being the universal egoity, or that supreme subjectivity of all experiencing. This is what Pratibha represents. So you were absolutely right to question this. This was, I think, quite frankly, could have been just a slip of a, just an error, as I said. With us who are not Sanskritists, whenever we deal with Sanskrit terms, we can bring a term being absolutely sure that we are operating with the, with the correct terminology, and then it can be a lapsus. So maybe let us add just a little bit more on what also Pratibha represents from the unique point of view of how it is viewed in Kashmir Shaivism. Because Abhinavagupta gives Pratibha a unique quality, science, that unique quality. Pratibha here also stands for the creative insight. So according to Abhinavagupta, in his interpretations of the text of the Bharata, right, the text on the Rasavada, the Rasavidya, when he was giving the expositions, he gave this Pratibha an important role, because this is a quality that is shared equally by a poet or an artist or creator and the one who partakes in the work of art. In the case of that particular discourse, that in Tantra Loka, he speaks of the poet and how someone who partakes in the work of that poet and reads that poetry, that very same principle is being ignited. And that same principle of Pratibha, that genius behind that creation. In fact, there is another, by the way, direct translation of that term is a genius. Just simple as that. Pratibha is a genius. So any outstanding qualities in any domain, any area, is because of and due to the presence of Pratibha. So it's an interesting perspective with regard to the creation and with regard to partaking in the work of art, which according to Abhinavagupta is equally shared by the creator and by the one who partakes, simply because this is on the shared territory of consciousness. And therefore there is no inferiority in the one who appreciates the verse of a poet. The poet maybe was overwhelmed with that creative inspiration which resulted in the outpouring of this or that verse, song, or whatever that may be. And yet the one who partakes in that, if one is able to extract the very aesthetic qualities that are embedded in that outpouring, then that in turn invokes the very same pratibha. And in that very moment, the poet and the one who partakes in the poem merge into that very same, what here pratibha represents, because all this is illumined by light of the same consciousness. And it is for you to see why that is important. Why that is important, why that is also interesting as well, why that is of import here. Now, going back to that, what the aforementioned teacher perhaps was trying to communicate, he was speaking about Pratibimba, which is kind of, not very similar, but kind of starts with that sound of. So it's a theory of reflection, Pratibimba, at times also referred to as Bimba Pratibimba, and it is equally figured in the Advaita Vedanta, particularly in Vivarana school of the Advaita Vedanta, and also in Kashmir Shaivism. So this theory of reflection here states that the world of all these forms and phenomena is reflected in consciousness, and that the reflection is identical with that what is real here in terms of what gives that reflection. The only difference is that in the case of the Advaita Vedanta, and there are also several slight differences because not all of them agree completely. The Shankara's interpretations of the Brahma Sutras maintain that this is very principle of Atman is Brahman. So if Atman reflects in the mirror of Brahman, then that reflection is not different. And the only difference here is that the world itself is considered to be a projection of one's own awareness, or projections of one's own mind in this case. And therefore, the world doesn't have substance, no reality of its own. Whereas, from the standpoint of view of Kashmir Shaivism, the take is different in as much as the reflection here is understood to be just as real as the one who reflects in it. But in both cases, you see, in both cases, the so-called analogy of the mirror and that what is reflected in the mirror is one and the same. And of course, there are a variety of expositions both in the Advaita Vedanta and in the Kashmir Shaiva literature, where that mirror analogy is being used over and over. And it doesn't matter how small is the mirror, whatever it reflects in the frame of that mirror, all the mountains and everything, it is the property of that mirror. It is one with that mirror. You break that mirror and there's no reflection. So the mirror analogy here has often played the role to give this also greater understanding of the subject-object relationship of which we talk on every given occasion. In this case, the term that very also, by the way, you can come across of this as Bimba Pratibimba or Bimba Pratibimba Vada. Pratibimba Vada simply stands here for a theory, stands here for the school. So that Pratibimba Vada extrapolates this that the very reflection here of the one who reflects in it is always, always the subject. And the subject which sees itself in the mirror sees nothing other than one's own self, which is pretty obvious, right? When you look at the mirror, you're seeing yourself there. You don't question that. It's plainly and utterly obvious. You look in the mirror and you see yourself. In the very same way, consciousness beholds itself in the mirror, which is the world. So the Kashmir Shaiva stand of the analogy here of that particular Pratibimba Vada school of thought is that the reality of the world here is the reality of the one who reflects on it. And it is always a subject that recognizes the object of its reflection. So now what is of value here is that whatever we perceive out there, whatever we see out there, whatever we cognize out there, first has to exist in the very subjectivity of our perception, in the subjectivity to begin with. So in other words, we never see anything out there. That what we see out there is the very, very mechanics of Maya. What we see, rather, is always our own self. Just as an example with the mirror given, when you stand in front of the mirror and look at the mirror, you see yourself. So this example is then transferred and translated into seeing the world of forms and phenomena. And what one sees is only a projection of one's own self. Always. So in other words, we can go further. In order for us to perceive anything as an object of our perception, that what is an object of our perception has to be already embedded in the subjectivity of our capacity to perceive. Without that being so, we will not be able to perceive anything. So just as simple as perceiving, let's say, a cup on my desk, that cup has to exist in my own awareness already, in the subjectivity of my own awareness, before I can recognize this cup as a cup for what it is. If it was not, this cup would not exist there. This is pure, unadulterated non-duality. This is pure subjectivity. Everything we see, everything we behold is nothing other than one's own self. So this is the value of the theory of reflection. And this is spoken often in terms of the attitude as well. That attitude from the standpoint of what Bimba Pratibimba or Pratibimba Vada represents here is an attitude that we consciously partake via the root of understanding that anything that I perceive is only on the account of that already being my very own dear subjective awareness. So object does not exist independent from subject, cannot exist independent from subject. Not only that, that what we consider to be an object, in fact, nothing other than subject, simply perceiving itself for its own sport, glory, whatever, thrill, whatever you may want to here add for the sake of making this more compatible to your way of understanding. It's an exercise. We take it up on ourselves. How does this work also? And what are the distinctions? Perhaps we should dedicate maybe a retreat to that, because it's a very big theme. Specifically, if we are to give it full justice to the way Kashmir Shaivism expounds on that, because there are details and there are some nuances here, and namely, these nuances have been introduced by Abhinavagupta again, right, this luminary. In re-examining that existent Pratibimba theory, he came up with further elaborations on the importance of why that mirror analogy here needs to be clear enough. You see, in the case of the Advaita Vedanta, there's nothing to wipe. Do you understand why? The mirror itself doesn't need to be wiped, because the mirror that reflects Brahman, it's only an appearance, and therefore the locus of that, what is avidya, is, you see, the very, very fact that it holds Brahman in disguise. So therefore nothing is required. Whereas from the point of view of Tantric Shaivism, in particular Trika Shaivism, that mirror is a fully fledged reality of Shiva. Therefore cannot be dismissed on the account of being pure projection of the mind. And it is required, therefore, to be in a pristine state. So therefore, I'm saying that we need to revisit that, because there is the importance of the tattvas and how all these qualities, faculties, play a role here. How that multiplicity is being perceived through this mirror, which is nothing other than the chit. This is what this Pratibimba is. Pratibimba, perceiving your own self. That mirror here, as an analogy, reflects all this, and everything that it reflects then gives the appearance of multiplicity, whereas the perceiver is always one. The perceived is always a multiplicity of objects that are being perceived, whereas the perceiver is always a singularity. So, not going fully into this, as I said, this would require a very detailed discourse on how these faculties that are here expressive potentiality of the great elements, which in turn the expression of the senses, which gives rise to the tanmatras, and in turn to the mahabhutas, indriyas and karmendriyas, and all of that sets in motion and gives us this fullness of perception, 5 senses, organs of perception, right? All this is fully intact, and that's what that mirror is made of, and what this gives us the possibility of that perception. So the analogy of mirror need to be in a pristine state so that Shiva can behold itself without any abstraction is of value. But one way or another, this perception here is always one with the perceiver. So whatever, for you to take it with you now, even as we speak, whatever you perceive this on the account of it, first and foremost, being structured in your consciousness already, structured in you as the subject. So whatever you perceive, pen, tree, mountain, any situation, geopolitical or otherwise, you perceive it because it is already structured in you as the subject. If it was not so, there will be no possibility. So already you are one with whatever you perceive irrespective of the quality of that perception, you are already one with whatever is being perceived. I hope that is clear. So this is as much as the theory of reflection is concerned.
And the example Shunyamurti was giving was that contemplating on authoritarian leadership, because that's what he was speaking of, is equivalent to contemplating the supremacy of consciousness. That's what he was saying.
So we need to separate the wheat from the chaff here. I cannot tell you exactly what he meant and what he said, because I'm not here to interpret the value of the validity of the example he gave. But as far as the theory of reflection goes, anything that we perceive it because it is the projected quality of our awareness as the mind. So that is correct. Whatever we perceive, any geopolitical situation, any whatever there is, present itself as a calamity, the end of the world, the beginning of the world, or the world never ends, totalitarian system, complete freedom, is only perceived only because we are capable of perceiving it. You see? We are capable of perceiving it only because that is the projection of my own very self. So I don't want to go into the interpretation of what this other teacher said. My own job here is to give you as clear and as direct apprehension of the theory of reflection. You see? Because it will dilute now the value of what this now presented itself through this opportunity. Because if we go into scrutinizing what someone said, we might just lose the precious opportunity to arrive with either a fresh understanding or a possibility of having yet another angle at which we have been reviewing this. So I want to just read you a very simple quote that was just like thrown at me perfectly here on social media that belongs to Swami Lakshmanju, smack on the topic. The universe, as we see it, is a reflection of the mirror of God consciousness. Period. Swami Lakshmanju. Just to clarify, God consciousness, spoken by Swami here, the Swami, was not spoken in terms of the gradations as we speak of with regard to the Maharishi Mahesh yogis elaborating between cosmic consciousness, God consciousness, and unity. God consciousness, Swami Lakshmanju meant Shiva, right? So it's the totality. So the universe is a reflection of Shiva in the mirror of his own awareness. Period. This is all the understanding that is required. Whether we like, dislike what we perceive, it doesn't matter. This is already secondary. This is the leftover of that lesha vidya that needs to be digested. You see? So I would like to maybe take this opportunity to link this with some other discourses that you have heard plenty of time, so this will become clearer. This is nothing other than the earlier teachings that we have had the privilege to begin with when we first ventured out many years ago, and for a number of years, exemplified in the teachings of Prakasha and Vimarsha. Remember that? Prakasha and Vimarsha. The so-called dyadic relationship of Shiva Shakti. Remember me saying that any student of Tantra, if they do not understand the relationship between Prakasha and Vimarsha, they will not have proper foundations to proceed. Because the relationship of Prakasha, as that quality of Shiva as that pure awareness, the light of awareness, and Vimarsha as that reflective quality which reflects its own light back onto itself, as Shakti, is the very, very core and foundational teachings upon all tantras rest without exception. So I just never spoke about Pratibimba Vada or Bimba Pratibimba simply because I prefer to deliver it in terms of these two terms, Prakasha and Vimarsha. And we know very well now that Sundari already offers this in German language. So it's the relationship of awareness in the way it is aware of itself. It is the relationship of light of awareness and its self-reflective power to be aware of itself. That's the dyadic relationship between Shiva, Prakash, and Shakti, Vimarsha. So that's the same. This is the very principle of the Bimba Pratibimba. That what is here really in action, in motion. So, anything to clarify with regard to that? Anything, any kind of like a piggyback on these questions? I mean, on this what we spoke just now. So I hope you understand now. So we spoke about just now, right? Pratibha, right? That Pratibha is the light of consciousness as that intuitive insight, as that creative insight. It's also spoken of and often translated in Sanskrit dictionaries, if you look into, ever dash creative quality of awareness. Ever creative, because that's what Pratibha is. Though it may be experienced directly as the flash, illuminating flash of our own consciousness, it is nothing other than ever creative quality of awareness, always present. And after that, we spoke about that theory of reflection so as to clarify to perhaps what that aforementioned teacher was trying to speak when he gave his discourse, erroneously calling it Pratibha.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
When you said that our ability to perceive something is because we already have that capacity, are you saying it comes from memory? There's a memory of it?
Who is speaking? I can't see you.
Oh, it's me, it's Fire.
Oh, okay. So can you just say it again?
Sure. When you said that our ability to perceive something is because it's already present within us, is that presence from memory?
Oh, good question. No. Everything that we perceive as an object of our perception is in fact nothing other than pure subjectivity reflected back onto itself. So, in other words, perception in itself is a projected quality. So, in other words, perception is an outwardly flowing quality. You see? So, in other words, in order to understand it, let's say gesturally, when you're seeing, beholding, understanding something, it's not because it's coming from there into you and you are understanding it, perceiving it. But the other way around, it is because it's coming out of you in the first place that you have the capacity to understand it at all. Therefore, it was given. If I were to reach for this cup, it is because this cup already fully present in my consciousness as the cup, and only as a result, an outcome of that, it is present through this marvel of the way how it is then experienced through the fullness of that texture that the Tanmatras, Mahabhutas, Indriyas and Karmindriyas represent here because this is all at the fullness of the capacity down to the senses to be experienced. But even if this is not to be experienced as something textural in terms of or from the domain of the senses, even if it's a thought that you perceive, it is the same.
That's incredible.
It is. I'm so glad you said that. It is bloody incredible. It's also astonishing. Astonishing. I will tell you, when I was sitting on a Primrose Hill in London some 20 years ago, and I was just, Primrose Hill, you see this view of London, right? And it's just a kind of elevated view from a residential area onto the city. And I was, there like kind of picnicking, doing a bit of meditation, a bit of reading. And suddenly I put the book down and I put whatever down, sandwich or whatever, I don't remember exactly. And whatever I have was in the field of my awareness there in terms of visual awareness was clearly understood immediately in its full totality, that nothing other than whatever I see, or whatever how far my sight could go, comes from nowhere other than my own self. And that what I perceive is nothing other than my own self. This, of course, is very difficult to convey in language. But this was that illuminating moment which pinned me down there, because it was incredible experience, incredibly liberating and insightful. Not yet there to stay, and this dance of subject and object entered this other phase. What I'm suggesting also to everyone here, to all of you, that this is available to you, because this, what Pratibimba Vada, or relationship between Shiva Shakti as Prakasha and Vimarsha, is at all times, and it's available to you for your own use at any time. Anytime you're perplexed by something, bewildered by something, or conflicted by something, you apply this understanding that whatever you perceive, you can only perceive on the account of its being yourself. It's an exercise, I dare to say right now. You see? And watch what happens. Watch what happens when that happens. This is the marvelousness and unfathomable nature of the way how that unmanifest and manifest all at once in that beautiful dance of Shiva, playing itself out in incomprehensible way. It is simultaneously multiversed. It is perceived in myriad of ways, and there are differences in terms of how each object differs from each other. And yet the totality of mirror, if that is once gotten, then all this is nothing other than that what is being reflected in the mirror of my own awareness. So the totality of these objects are now gain a very different picture. Okay, you're an artist. Let me give it to you another example. Some of you have this maybe greater degree of understanding now. When you look at the landscape and you see this, whatever you paint, about to paint, you see this, that, and you're lost in that. It's overwhelming, because what you perceive in an ordinary manner. You perceive in the manner of perceiving one object and then perceiving another object, because you cannot perceive totality And it's also habitual to perceive the faraway building. Oh, and there's a tree here. There is a lovely cloud forming. Oh, this is like a mountain range, what have you. So you kind of like move between object to another object. Excuse me. And yet when you will start actually painting it, you would have to kind of make a decision. How can I put it on a two-surface level? Oh, no, on a flat surface. It's 3D, and here's I'm, paint in my box like brushes. So whatever now is there would become property of this one piece of paper or canvas. So that whatever I perceived will now be one picture. That one picture is what this we're talking about. That building on the far away, that tree here, that forming cloud, that range of mountains or hills here, right? Whatever there is now on a flat surface of the paper, on the canvas, whatever that is, and can be perceived at once as picture. This is the marvel of also the kind of the subtler dimension of what the visual works of art can do. Suddenly it's a picture. In not unlike manner, this can also be our capacity, always at our capacity, to perceive this world as such, because that is what it is.
I see.
So this projected quality is what it is. This world, this whole world, the world is as you see it. Remember earlier years, earlier days? The world is as you see it. You cannot see the world other than how you are.